So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar in our series at 1 in 4, Overcoming Barriers for Adult Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse. And today we're focusing on barriers to accessing and engaging with the criminal justice system. I'm delighted to introduce Deirdre Kenny, who is our Director of Advocacy and also our Deputy CEO. And Deirdre has years of experience of supporting survivors through the criminal justice system. We are going to have a conversation for about 20 minutes and there will be time then for questions at the end, and you can use the Q&A function on your screens to put questions or comments as the conversation goes on. So Deirdre, good to talk to you.
Thanks, Maeve. Nice to be here.
So just to start, we know, Deirdre, in Ireland, there's actually quite a low incidence of people who've been sexually abused who actually decide to make a complaint to the Gardaí or engage in the criminal justice system. What do you think are the barriers that are there that really inhibit people who've been victims of a very serious crime of coming forward?
I think there's probably a number of factors involved, but firstly, it's important to look at what actually happens, the dynamics of childhood sexual abuse, and within that, what might make it difficult for people to come forward. And I think what we know is that child sexual abuse happens in secrecy very often, and that through grooming, the child is subtly drawn into a very manipulative and exploitative sexual relationship that essentially instills a sense of secrecy and fear, feelings of guilt and shame, and really hands the responsibility to the child in terms of what's happening. And that's a very powerful message that implicitly gets conveyed to the child. And in my experience of working with adult survivors, that message is still there and they still really kind of battle with that. So when you put that in the context of coming forward or walking into a Garda station or talking to an authority of any type, it's so difficult to bring for people to get that far, and I think that's a huge issue. I was looking at research recently around how family dynamics play a part in the disclosure process, and how the research examined people's reflections in terms of things like communication and the gender roles within families. And I suppose how children and women often play a very subservient role in families, and how that actually influences the disclosure process. So I think all of those things are at play, and then they are mirrored in society in terms of how, as a society, we avoid this issue, and how the denial and repression that survivors experience gets played out across the political sphere, media, you name it, it's there. So it's a huge barrier for a survivor who feels very isolated in terms of their experience to step outside of that dynamic and come forward to the Gardaí.
Do you think the fact that, you know, we're a very small country, and particularly outside the bigger cities, that everybody knows each other, everybody you know, gets to hear about what's going on in the town or the parish, whatever, is that a factor, do you think?
Absolutely. And I think Julie referenced it in the first webinar you did. I think shame is a massive issue across the spectrum for people who have experienced sexual violence, and that fear of exposure, and whether that's within your own community or your own family or your own workplace or your own, whatever your environment is, that fear and terror of exposure is so innate for survivors. So again, it's so difficult. And I think the world has got smaller. Things like social media have made connections with people that makes our worlds much smaller, and much the fear of exposure is much more innate. And yeah, absolutely, it's so difficult.
You mentioned families and the research you've been reading. Do you think there's a difference in willingness to come forward between people who are sexually abused within their family and perhaps somebody who's sexually abused by a stranger, or somebody, you know, maybe a professional that, you know, that they've come in contact with? Does that make a difference?
I suppose our history would say that when people started to come forward around the institutional abuse in Ireland, and abuse within the church, there was a different, I suppose, sense around that it was an other, and it, that there wasn't the same degree of secrecy. It's almost like family business is dealt with internally and shouldn't be in any way broadcast outside of the family. So I'm sure that's the case when you're not talking about sexual abuse, never mind something as taboo as sexual abuse. So I wouldn't like to say that it's easier for people to come forward, because I don't think it's easy at all. But I definitely think there's a difference if the abuse hasn't happened within the family. And certainly, again, that research spoke about the family dynamics, and even if the abuser wasn't within the family, the communication style of the family, if the father played a very dominant role and communication was very closed, then that made it much more difficult for children to speak out about their experience. And we know that that's the case across the board, and that most people wait until adulthood if they're going to disclose.
Okay. So just moving on, once somebody has made a decision that they do want to do something about this, they do want to maybe go and make a statement to the guards, what do you think, just based on what our clients at 1 in 4 tell us, what are people's experiences of engaging with the different aspects of the criminal justice system? Or, what impact does that have on a person?
I think increasingly, and especially in the last year, we've spoken to probably hundreds of people who have had time to reflect, probably because of lockdown, on their lives, and with maybe professional help or the support of loved ones, they've found a time or a place that it's almost like an overwhelming sense of, I want the world to know, but I want people to acknowledge the harm that I have been caused, whether that's in the family or in the community. And the criminal justice system, I suppose, isn't hugely sympathetic to the emotional turmoil that people experience, but it is a process. So it's quite boundaried and tight and almost limited, but it's one of the few processes that people have to actually try and address it. So when people do come forward to the Gardaí, obviously, given what I said earlier around the impact of the abuse, those dynamics can get kind of played out in terms of sitting down in front of an authority and being questioned about something very intimate. And sometimes people feel like they're the ones who've done something wrong. But at the same time, it can be quite a liberating experience, and people talk about having a weight lifted off them, and that in some way they've shifted the kind of the collusion almost, and given it to somebody or something outside of what's always been very present in their lives. So, it's different for everyone. It's definitely terrifying, I think people would describe it as, but there can be a relief in it, and a sense of liberation in terms of divesting yourself of that sense. But a lot of that has got to do with how they're responded to by professionals, and unconsciously sometimes professionals can display that denial and repression and avoidance in the language that they use, or their how they meet a person, their body language, their discomfort can actually be displayed, and my experience is that my clients have picked up on that. And so from a professional's point of view, whether you're a guard or a social worker or a solicitor, they're all things that in my experience my clients have been acutely aware of, and can be kind of off-putting. But it's in the main, people are very motivated because they feel it's the right thing for them, and I think that's what we'd always encourage people to go back to.
You mentioned the guards there, and we know that the Gardaí have put in place huge changes actually in how they respond to allegations of sexual violence generally, with the rollout of the regional special protective units and so on. Would you have noticed, say, in the last 5 to 10 years, a change in how our clients are met when they take that first step and make a statement?
Yes, in the main, I think there has been a huge shift for lots of reasons. I think survivors have made their needs much more known to the authorities, which is great, and people are willing to speak out about their experience, which I think helps. There's also been the Directive on Victims' Rights, which really imposes that these systems have to adhere to those rights. So I think that helps. I guess the risk is that all of those policies and procedures are very informed by legislation and not necessarily informed by what psychology knows about the trauma and how people are impacted. So the law, as we know, interacts with atrocities all the time that people experience in their lives, but it's not always very sympathetic to the impact of that violence. And that's one of the kind of blind spots that exists. And that's certainly a barrier that survivors come across all the time. So while they're trying to process the emotion and the hurt and the harm, the law is looking at it from a very clinical, cold perspective. And those two things don't necessarily marry. And I think that's why it's so important for people to get therapeutic support when they're going through the system, because it helps to kind of process the dynamics that are getting played out all the time.
Okay, and then moving on, if the case actually goes to trial, and we know a lot of cases don't because of lack of evidence and so on, but when our clients find themselves in a circuit criminal court or central criminal court, how do they describe their experiences there? Again, I think, unfortunately, the system sometimes mirrors the experience of the abuse itself, in that people feel a real power imbalance in terms of how the system deals with them. So the accused person's rights generally supersede the rights to anyone else in the process, and that's very frustrating. It feels very demeaning. It can be the process itself, or it can be the people that they meet within the process that kind of display that, I guess. And so people generally can feel quite vulnerable, but at the same time, there's a flip side to that in terms of being quite empowered to tell the truth about what happened. And I know it's often referred to as having your day in court or telling your story in court. That's not really what happens. Survivors are asked to recount traumatic events, and in a very cold clinical way. And sometimes that feels really overwhelming. But I think with the right support and the right knowledge and information about how the system works, and I think people can do that and survive it very well. And I think we see it all the time. People get through it, and I think when they know what to expect, that's half the battle. Okay, which leads me on to my next question, I suppose. I mean, what sort of support do people need in order that they will come through this process without being further harmed, actually? Information is key. I think any of us going into any situation, whether it's a new job or a pandemic or whatever, information is key. And I suppose sometimes the information that is relayed to people about the criminal justice system is the language isn't always easily digestible, or doesn't necessarily fit with how they experience the world. So communication can often be a difficulty. So I suppose the support services that exist spend a lot of time trying to clarify things for people, and the system itself isn't always clear. You're not always sure if a case is going to get on because there are no judges available, and that's very frustrating. And it's a bit like if you turned up in hospital and there was no doctor to do your operation. It would just feel very
strange and bizarre, and how does the system work if those things don't exist? So there's a lack of trust maybe there in the first place, and then it gets reiterated by the lack of certainty. And that's something that I know the Department of Justice are working on, and there are changes afoot which I think will help, but I suppose sometimes the system doesn't necessarily understand where the survivor is at. And I think that's where services like 114 and the Rape Crisis Centres can kind of step into the fore and reassure people about how things should work and what they can expect. And that information really does make a difference to people, because they feel it's almost, as someone said to me the other day, it's like just having someone on your side, or someone who gets what you're going through, so you don't have to explain yourself all the time. And I think that's something that's really valuable to people in those circumstances.
And maybe it's important to explain. I mean, people often ask me, oh, is the prosecution barrister not there for the survivor?
Yeah, I guess, and what people often forget is that it's actually the state who prosecutes an accused person, and the survivor is a witness for the state, so they don't necessarily have their own legal representation. And while the DPP's office and the senior and junior counsels make huge efforts to try and communicate as best they can, there's limits, I suppose, to what their job is in that role. So I guess that's where our advocacy case managers and the other services have people who step in and fill that gap around information. And just it's almost like, if you can have a connection with somebody who understands you in the system, it helps not to feel so isolated and so, I suppose, vulnerable in something that can be quite intimidating.
Okay. Deirdre, I mean, if you were to be able to wave a magic wand and, change things, and I would appreciate there's so many changes happening now, especially after the O'Malley review of the trial of sexual offences. And, I think we all acknowledge the Department of Justice is working really hard and very fast to implement the recommendations of that report. But if you were able to wave a magic wand, what changes would you make that really would have a positive impact on people's experience in court?
I think there's lots of things. From a practical point of view, things like language and even things like the layout of a courtroom, there's simple practical changes like that I think could make a difference. In terms of, it's almost like you want to give people, the professionals involved in the criminal justice system, whether it be guards or solicitors or barristers, an insight into the survivor's world and what that's like from their perspective. So while you're not asking them to change their role, I think the interaction that survivors have with professionals could be better. And I think that's about, while the system needs to share information about how it works, also, I think we need to share information, or the system needs to educate itself about how survivors interact with the system and the impact of the system on them. And that's one of the things that we recommended when we spoke to the Oireachtas Committee, was really just an impact assessment of how at different stages of, for instance, a criminal trial, whether it be language or process, how it actually impacts on survivors. And that research would give insight that I think that would help change, very simple changes, but could bring about things that would be really effective for people.
Okay, and finally, Deirdre, you mentioned COVID and the impact that has had on survivors, and the increased numbers reaching out to 114 and other services like ours. How is the system going to cope with those numbers?
That's a good question. And I think we're starting to see the impact of that already. There's a few things. I think more and more people are reaching out to report in, and I don't know how long that will continue at the pace it's at, but obviously the guards will feel the burden of that, and they need to be properly resourced to do that. The other issue is that the courts have been backed up for years, and they do their best, but with COVID then further backups have happened. And delay is probably, if going back to your wish list question, if delay could be addressed, I think that would really really help address the kind of issues for the professionals and the people who engage in the system. So resources are the main issue, and I think that's we all need to be better resourced to deal with the impact of child sexual abuse in terms of incidences that have occurred maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, but the system is trying to catch up now. And I know the statistic, I think, for the amount of reports made around historic sexual abuse last year was about 900,000 people came forward to the Gardaí. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, if that's increased next year.
As a result of COVID and what people have been doing. Okay, so finally, Deirdre, is there something we haven't touched on, something you'd really just like to say, particularly if there are survivors listening to this?
I suppose for me, the battle that we experience the most in 1 in 4 in terms of listening to our clients and engaging in the system is really about the societal issues and the societal denial of sexual abuse. I think that's something that all of us need to grasp a hold of and try and deal and create a country, an atmosphere where survivors are not further victimized by our ignorance, I suppose, would be the issue, and that's going to take time to change, but I think that's something that we really need to do.
Okay, so Deirdre, we've come to the end of our conversation. So I'll ask Kerry from 1 in 4 to join us, and Kerry will be able to put the questions that people have been asking.
Hi, Maeve. Hi, Deirdre. So some of the questions that have been coming in are all related to the survivor's experience within the criminal justice system, and specifically when things maybe don't go as planned. So the first question is, what happens when the DPP decides not to move forward with a case? Or when they do move forward, but the survivor might not get the outcome that they had hoped for? What's next after that, and what is the impact of that on the survivor?
Yeah, I guess that's a very good question. And unfortunately, if the DPP decides not to prosecute, and that's been appealed and that process has come to an end, there's very little else that the justice system can offer somebody. It's not unusual that people don't get the result they want when a case actually does get to court, and that can be devastating. But surprisingly, I have to say that it's less devastating than you would think. With the right support, people tend to actually get a perspective on things that is meaningful to them. It's not maybe what they wanted. I suppose, surprisingly, people often come back to me even after they've got a conviction and the person has been sentenced, and they still don't feel hugely, I suppose, vindicated by what happened. And they're surprised at that, because they think the motivation might have been to send the person to prison, but actually the impact is more telling their story and telling their truth and having that dealt with. So it's a difficult one. I think that's why, if we put all our eggs in that basket, I think there's always going to be disappointment, because the system isn't really built to deal with the emotional fallout of sexual abuse. So, and again, that's why I'd always recommend that people engage in therapy to kind of complement that journey through the system, because the issues that come up can't be addressed by a jury, and they can't be addressed by a judge. And it's important that if the outcome is not the one that you wanted, that you have that support there to kind of try and process it, and not to feel that in any way that you've been to blame for that. And more often than not, the law doesn't meet the needs. I mean, how it restrictions, I suppose, that it puts on these things make it difficult to get a prosecution.
But can I ask, Deirdre, I mean, if the DPP decides not to prosecute, or indeed if there is a not guilty verdict, does that mean that the victim has been telling lies?
No, not necessarily. Absolutely not. And I think the DPP has commented on that herself publicly, in that it's not that the person who comes forward is not believed by any stretch of the imagination. It's more that the system doesn't necessarily lend itself to, the rules and the processes in the system don't necessarily lend itself to prosecuting the case. And that's another societal issue. We put so much time and energy into dealing with crimes in our courts that we don't necessarily think about how else can we address this? How else can we meet the needs of survivors without kind of just shoving them into a courtroom and saying, well, that'll decide whether it happened or not. Just because a court, you know, someone comes back, or you can get a hung jury, you can get a not guilty. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. That just means that the law couldn't prove that it happened.
Thanks. Do you have other questions, Kerry?
Yes, following on from that, I was hoping you could maybe speak to if there's any protections or support structures in place for survivors outside of the criminal justice system. Say, for instance, a survivor of child sexual abuse that was committed by a family member for a long period of time, or someone very prominent within a community, and that survivor's fear of repercussions if they do decide to go forward. How can they deal with the guilt of dropping a bomb like that within a family dynamic, and what kind of protections, if any, are in place to ensure their safety?
That's a lot of questions in one question. Yeah, I suppose once the guilt issue, I guess, is very personal and can be very overwhelming, and that's really where people need to access professional help and support, whether it be therapy or an advocacy service, but certainly a specialist support service that can help them process that. Special protections, I mean, once somebody engages in the system and they've spoken to the Gardaí, if there is a threat to their lives or intimidation or anything like that, that's taken very seriously by the Gardaí and would certainly be addressed by them in the system, or, you know, whatever's appropriate. But yes, the fear is great and very real for people. And again, it's so important that they engage with professional help. And look, I mean, Gardaí who work in this area are very experienced, and the chances are they understand the dynamics and they've seen it before. So very often we'll arrange for people to have kind of informal chats with the guards around exploring making a statement before people take that leap, and that can be really helpful to kind of reassure people, or not, as the case may be, but at least they've got information and they can use that to try and make the right decision for themselves. Reporting to the Gardaí is not the be all and end all, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing for you, and that's absolutely your choice and should always be the case.
Okay, we just have time for one more question, I think, Kerry.
Yes, what are your thoughts on survivors being asked to disclose information about the perpetrator and details before, if it's known, before they are ready? Do you think that this might put off survivors from coming forward or engaging in therapy?
Yeah, I guess it's a very delicate balance, and something I know that does happen. Sometimes people are approached by a Gardaí because they might have information, and it can really trigger something in people that they weren't expecting, and it can have a devastating impact. For a lot of people who come forward, you know, it's been a long process to get there, to make that decision. But if you're doorstepped with something, that can really propel you into like chaos and really upsetting. So again, it's not something that we would encourage, but I guess it can happen, and it's so important for people to get the support they need in that situation. And a lot of professionals who work in the area would understand the complexities of that, but sometimes that can be overlooked, and I think it's not always understood how that interaction can really bring stuff to the surface and can really impact people. But again, it's so important that people reach out for support with that.
Mm.
So I think that brings us to the end. And in fact, that last question will be addressed further in terms of the child protection system in our next webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time, when I'll be talking to Dr. Joe Mooney from UCD, who has a special interest in the whole area of child protection in this country. So Deirdre, I'd like to thank you very much for taking part today, and to thank everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.